Robert Fox is London Evening Standard defense editor. Welcome to our program, Mr. Fox.
Hello, good afternoon from London.
Ukraine has launched a mass production of long-range cruise missile Flamingo with a range of more than 1,600 miles and with a warhead twice as powerful as Tomahawk cruise missile, according to the Associated Press. Also, US President Trump says that Ukraine needs to strike inside Russia to win the war. Does it mean that Ukraine still has some cards during these negotiations?
I think so, but I would imagine with President Zelensky that in view of the pantomime, the show, no-show in Alaska, that they're not banking on talks anytime soon. Certainly, Putin doesn't want to talk to him. And I don't think Zelensky, quite rightly, would want to talk to anybody else, particularly as we should say that that the accompanying rhetoric and propaganda around talks, no talks, the outcome from Alaska and so on is so extravagant, particularly from Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, who seems to be the leading mouth for the Kremlin at the moment on this. It's very well orchestrated, but he's going back to basics. He's doubling and tripling down. He's more or less saying that he doesn't want the, forget about Minsk 1 and 2, the various things before then, even the Istanbul terms and treaty so-called of 2022, and I think we must discuss that because it was a very important and underreported element in the talks in Alaska. But let's go to the maximalist position that Lavrov is now expounding. He's more or less saying that we want to sort of build the Berlin Wall. We want to go back to the kind of prestige and position and power that the Soviet Union had. He's mischievous because when he turned up at Alaska, as you will have seen at the Anchorage venue for the conference, he was wearing a ice hockey shirt with the blazon of the Soviet Union on it, CCCP. So we know where it's going. And this is hubris. This is pride before a fall. Putin has been persuaded he's on a roll, that they're going to get Donetsk by the end of the year. We've heard that at the end of last year. I'm not saying that things are good there because you're much closer to it than I am, and it's a very, very tough fight by all accounts, and some good first-hand accounts now reaching the BBC, done by the BBC, which I think is very, very important. But all is not lost for Ukraine. I think this is the point. And Ukraine and its European allies, it has to be that, like include Britain among those, have now got to work out a game plan to get through the next 6 months and get to the next position. Because I think the position of Moscow, particularly regarding the economy, is going to be very different by the time we get to next April.
Does it mean that Russia cannot sustain this war next year? Because US Vice President JD Vance says that he hopes that the war in Ukraine would be settled within 6 months. What is your reaction to this?
My reaction to JD Vance is fascinating. I think that here is a man who is educated, who's highly intelligent, but he's got an absolutely hopeless approach to history. As you probably gather, he has what we call, like one of these stores where you can pick and mix your candies and sweets that you go to, known as the pick and mix tray. That's JD Vance on history. He plucks a sort of half fact from history and says that applies to everybody. He said there were negotiations at the end of World War II where things had to happen, and therefore there will be negotiations and land swaps resolving the war in Ukraine. But this is a hopeless position. Anyway, it's not quite true because Japan and Germany surrendered in World War II, and there was very, very little negotiation altogether. Perhaps that's the JD Vance version of negotiation. But let's not completely be sneered. There's been much too much sneering and condescension in the commentary up to now. JD Vance is interesting because he educates himself He's much better educated than Trump, for example. And I think he's adjusting his approach to Europe. And I think that this has come about not because of, but in the circumstances of his summer vacation with himself and his wife in the Cotswolds area of the UK. And he cemented his friendship with David Lammy, the Foreign Minister, Foreign Secretary of the UK. And this is fascinating because the link is certainly not ideology, and it's certainly not politics, but the link is that they, and Mrs. Vance indeed, are staunch Roman Catholics. And this is so they have a basis of trust. And the great thing is he dishes out insults from time to time. We saw that at the Munich security conference with JD Vance, and I find that gratuitous and silly and rather juvenile. But he does learn and he does engage. And I think he's got to respect the intellect and the ability of the likes of, particularly, I would think, Mark Rutte, that I think that they know that they have to take President Stubb of Finland very, very seriously indeed. The resolve of Poland to build up its defenses and the warnings from Poland are being taken very seriously. And Kasia Kallas is also very important. That she is almost a sort of yin and yang version of JD Vance, because she could be as outspoken as he. But these are important voices now, and they're really important in that the big players like Macron in France, Starmer in the UK, and because he has the ear of Trump, and also Friedrich Merz, have to listen to these characters. So I've made it sound like a pinball game, but it isn't. There's a lot more moving than appears. And Russia, it's very interesting that both Putin and Trump have got too much on their plate. They're being too busy. They're being distracted. There's the Caucasus for Putin, and Putin has to worry the access of the West, particularly countries like Italy, to the hydrocarbon output from the Caspian that they're now getting via Azerbaijan, and they've stitched up Azerbaijan's local difficulties, which are tranquilized now with Armenia and with, to an extent, with Iran, very, very important, so they can get their energy out. That's a very, very important factor. And the energy picture for Russia must be something which gives them concern, particularly as Ukraine is being so successful in attacking energy distribution points, refineries and pumping stations. And this worries Putin because it affects the export, sanctions-busting export of oil.
You just mentioned about deep strikes inside Russia. Let's cover also Ukraine new mass production of long-range missiles Flamingo, with a range of more than 1,600 miles. What is your take on that, and how can you also react to the recent publication by Wall Street Journal that Pentagon was restricting Ukraine's ability to strike inside Russia? And let us begin with the Flamingo missile.
Let's begin with Flamingo. You make two very good points there. Flamingo is something that I think Ukraine had to go to, because this is the part of the Biden legacy, which is almost dichotomous. It's the other half of the seed in foreign policy terms with Trump. They do not want to strike deep into Russia. Now, the point with Biden, and it's the same with Biden and Obama, during the Afghanistan contest, they were always restrained. They didn't want to maximize effort. And the great thing with Obama, Biden, and Biden was a continuity: we mustn't provoke Russia. We mustn't provoke Russia. We're going to avoid a NATO war. By the way, we've been skeptical because of Trump's questioning of what Article 5, the mutual defence if attacked, article, a founding article of NATO, really means it's optional. You can do it by choice and it has to be done by a vote, etc. That isn't unique to Trump. By the way, that the Biden administration was also implying that, and they were scared very, very seriously about the prospect of getting involved in the European war on behalf of NATO. So there is a continuity there. Now, the important thing is, and I think Trump has been helpful here in warning to Europe, get on with it. You've got to do it yourself. And this is where he's asked, I think mistakenly, Trump, for British leadership, because British leadership is fixated on Trump and the support of Trump at the moment. We'll park that. But I'm going to get back to the answering your question now. Please forgive me, giving that background to it. Because of what I've said about American reluctance, not wanting to attack into Russia, it was always plain, I think, from February 2022 on, that Washington was so against deep strike weaponry from the first. Remember the questions about HIMARS, which could penetrate into Russian territory, not very far, maybe. They didn't particularly want the Brits to send Storm Shadow, which proved very effective, and Stekov, the French twin. It's exactly the same product, more or less. They're made by the same Anglo-French Italian company, MBDA. But America was even reluctant about that, and they proved very successful, particularly as we know, in neutralizing the Black Sea Fleet. But it was clear then that Ukraine had to develop its own version, because where American reluctance has been so successful is in stopping the Germans, whether it's Scholz before and now Metz, from releasing the Taurus missile, which would do a lot of damage where it's needed in the forming up points, the logistics points of this very, very crowded deep battle space supporting the action. About up to nearly 750,000 of military personnel. And you've got to strike into that. Ammunition dumps, transportation routes, and above all, fuel and food supply lines. They prevented that. So I'm answering your question. Yes, yes, yes. It could be decisive, but why, for goodness sake, master of propaganda and publicity, why did Mr. Zelensky have to brag about this at the Independence Day celebration? You know, the thing is to underpromise and overdeliver. Walk quietly and have a very big stick behind your back. And it's not even clear that Flamingo will work to that extent. We don't know what countermeasures would be involved and so on. And meanwhile, we have got the big bombs, the Fab 500, and possibly even bigger by the Russians being used. So we are in a big arms race. But I think if Flamingo, if it works, it's exactly what is required. And I think it could be very important. And I have to add to that as a footnote, they have been very effective, and I think we shouldn't talk about it too much. I think deep subversive operations in and across the Russian Empire, the Russian Federation, and also a very, very important factor. And the fact that we're getting such little publicity about it is another very important factor. I think in pure Marxist terms, the superstructure is coming away from the base in terms of the political leadership in Russia. They're out of touch with what's really going on in the country. And what really goes on in the country, particularly in the shopping basket, is going to be critical over the next 3 months.
Let's cover Russian dictator Putin's policy and his strategy for these negotiations. Russia has not accepted any kind of location or place for direct negotiations between President Zelensky and Vladimir Putin. Is Vladimir Putin afraid of personal meeting with Zelensky? And what is next Putin's strategy with these negotiations? Has he promised Trump something bigger, any kind of large concessions, or he is at risk right now to overplay his hand with this proposal to settle war?
He's being a terrific smartass, and I think that that's where possibly he's making his mistake. He was absolutely gleeful, full of glee, as to how he wrong-footed Trump. And it's very interesting to examine why and how Trump was wrong-footed at Alaska. He came away with absolutely nothing. They had to cancel half the meeting. They had to cancel the lunch. It was only a 3-minute statement. And usually Trump blabs on forever and ever on these occasions, teases the press, shouted at them, a straight statement, 3 minutes, no Q&A, and no even shouting at the press, saying maybe, there are big obstacles to this. We've got to see how we're going to meet. And the grinning Putin says, well, maybe we'll meet again in Moscow, as if it was a sort of a French Nouvelle Vague movie. What had happened was that they had made it clear what their position was. And of course, Russia was much, much better organized than the US at the Alaska talks. I think that the misfortune was, and it may turn out even to be unfortunate for Russia, not in the short term, but the long term, is that Steve Witkoff really thought he had a deal leading to a ceasefire and a basis on which they could negotiate territory. Remember what his link to Trump is. He talks Trump's language. And what is that language? Property. And that's, when Trump was blabbing about oceanfront property, that's the best, perhaps they could exchange it, you knew exactly where their head was. They hadn't got their head round it. Now, what had also happened, I don't know whether it's become clear, but its Foreign Policy magazine has got a whole set of articles and insights, which I've not read anywhere else. And it seems to be very, very well founded, because I've looked up the documentation to this. Foreign Policy magazine said that we had to take Lavrov seriously when he arrived in Anchorage, saying, our position is our position of February 2022, and of the treaty, in inverted commas, we prepared in Istanbul for later that summer. And they put it down. And by the way, in the briefing documents to the media, if they wanted to look it up, there is a reference to this. I don't think it was spelled out, but if you followed the reference, you could look up the document I have here in front of me, which is the TASS summary of the Istanbul terms of 2022. And it's more or less, let's go back to the Budapest acknowledgement of Ukraine's sovereignty, very relevant in the aftermath of the celebration, quite right, of Ukrainian independence. And it was more or less said, forget about 2014, forget about Minsk 1 and 2. We really want Ukraine to be a cipher. We want it to be a country which is neutral, which it disarms, that it has a permanent Russian presence in Kiev, overseeing or monitoring government, and we want the ethnic and linguistic traditions of what we regard the Russian population of Ukraine to be acknowledged, with Russian being an official language, with Ukrainian the official language. This was available on August the 15th. And yet, sadly, if you follow the New York Times, which I follow slavishly, if you follow the commentary in the Economist magazine, very international, they're blah, blah, blah. Will they meet again? The Europeans meet again. Will Zelensky go to Moscow? Will Moscow go to Zelensky? Will Zelensky meet one-on-one with Putin? Will Putin meet with three together, Zelensky and Trump? And it just wasn't there. It wasn't going to happen, because again, on a visit to I think to the Alaska meeting, Lavrov goes to Jordan and gives a couple of interviews, and he's absolutist about this, and he is pretty damn clear that he sees. I mean, not for nothing did he have the logo of the USSR on his sweatshirt at Alaska. He wants all that back. And in the Jordan or pre-Jordan press statements and interviews, he makes it clear that Russia makes claim to its former territories now part of NATO, a direct threat on the three Baltic countries. So that's where we are. Plus, we have had something beginning there just in the last few days. So I think the Kiev press has noted very carefully interference with GPS and other communication satellite system, a cyber attack right along that Baltic littoral coastline. So it not only involves the three Baltic countries, now members of NATO, former part of the Soviet Union, it's a direct threat to Poland and to Finland as well.
Does it mean that the US President Donald Trump decided to hold this summit in Alaska with Vladimir Putin just because Steve Witkoff told him that he had secured a deal with Vladimir Putin? And right now we understand that Witkoff just has misunderstood Russian dictator.
That apparently is the case, and this is why the Witkoff story is very, very curious. Witkoff apparently, on his last visit to Moscow, didn't take his own interpreters with him. Witkoff has been going to Russia for a long, long time, and I believe he has some sort of rough working knowledge of Russian. So he took the Russian interpreters. And why my suspicions, I think, are supported is, if you recall, and prior to Alaska, but after the visit, when he was saying that they'd got a deal, he gave some very ambiguous statements and interviews in the round of Sunday television appearances. It wasn't clear what he thought Putin was talking about, and what I think it may have been somebody like Dmitriev, who's a very important interlocutor in this, may have said, oh, we've got a bit of northern Ukraine, I think quite marshland territory in our hands, we'll give it back, but we want the Donbass. But it also is clear, is it not, and I'm sure you understand in you and Kiev and Ukraine, is that they were talking about the whole concept, and it's a sort of Catherine the Great pipe dream of Novia Russia again. They're claiming, and I think it was a high roll, a big gamble. Maybe it will work, maybe it wasn't. They were trying to grab most of Ukraine's Black Sea coast, Kherson and Zaporizhia, and to threaten, therefore, Mykolaiv and above all, Odessa.
Let's also cover security guarantees related discussions. US President Donald Trump has promised at least air support for the possible European allies' peacekeeping mission in Ukraine. What is your assessment of the possibility of Ukraine receiving this Article 5-like security guarantee?
I don't know where to start, but I'm going to give an image to you, first of all. Kabul, August 21. Before that, America had given over-the-horizon air support guarantees, theoretically. Although, again, it was in Trump's time. I have no idea what the secret deal with the Taliban was in Doha in 2018. But it was a gimme. The Article 5 thing, I don't know where it came from or who brought it up. I suspect it's a very interesting piece of a thought game from Russia, and it's clever because the Russians would know Article 5 is being questioned by many Americans, and not just of the right, and it is a keystone in a defensive treaty. NATO is two things. NATO is a defensive treaty, and it's also democratic. You may say, oh, the theory is just theory of NATO being democratic, but it has its delegations where the representatives of the democratic members of the allies send their representatives to the Northern Atlantic Council, the NAC, which would have to approve an Article 5. How can it approve an Article 5. And this is where you get into wonderful, absurd literature. It's something Lewis Carroll, the famous Alice in Wonderland logician, would have done in the 19th century, because you're going to have a defensive treaty for a defensive organization, alliance, to defend something which isn't in the alliance against, guaranteed in this defense against, for, by, or with the main protagonist, the main potential or actual enemy. By that I mean the Russian Federation. Have I confused you? Have I sounded as if I'm talking nonsense, that I'm just driveling, blah, blah, blah? I think you're very much entitled to have that opinion of what I've just said. It is simply a nonsense from beginning to end. And Trump, I don't think Trump knew it. I think people behind him knew it. But I think it's very interesting how Team Trump is changing around. And Team Trump, though, was very, very badly prepared in Alaska. There's an excellent piece I would recommend in The Economist by the very respected Canadian historian Margaret Macmillan about Do Summit's work. And she goes through a few. She mentions the famous one of Henry VIII of England in 1520, which is an enormous thing in France called the Field of the Cloth of Gold. She goes through various ones, and she talks about it in the last century, but particularly she focuses on the way Churchill used summits, particularly with allies. And she instances one. At the very beginning of 1943 in Casablanca, Churchill meets with Roosevelt to decide what the next future, the next steps in the war would have to be. Churchill is brilliant, contrary to the image of being flamboyant and, with wonderful language. He was brilliantly supported. He was brilliantly prepared by the head of the armed forces, de facto, but in fact the chief of the general staff, Lord Alan Brooke, as he became, in which they had information, details, strategic possibilities and opportunities, worst case scenarios as to why the invasion of Northern Europe by Britain and its allies like Canada, but above all Britain and America, would have to be put off until the first half or the middle of 1944. And it couldn't be done in 1943. And the American general quoted Julius Caesar and twisted it and said, we came, we saw, we didn't conquer, we were absolutely conquered by the British preparation, by its sheer volume of information and understanding. Now, Margaret uses that in this article. That's what didn't happen for Trump in Alaska. And I think that this is where countries like the Brits, who will be involved in this, whether they want it or not, however badly prepared they are, and they're very badly prepared at the moment, that they've got to learn from that. And this is going to be a European coalition with specific, very specific American support. And it's mostly comms, communications, and ISTAR, intelligence transmission, and so on. Perhaps long-range logistical transportation. But I think we're in a very, very difficult period now. And I think there are people in Britain who have understood this very, very well. People, may I say, and I won't go further, who have been very intimately involved in the last 4 years in your country's defence. And they understand. And one in a very senior position, I can't say who he is, said to me, managing the peace is going to be almost more difficult than managing support for the war in Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Fox, for your time and for your insightful answers, and glory to Ukraine.
Likewise, and the best of luck to you.